Chapter 3. I mustered my control and shut out the nerve impulse of pain. I don't know how long it was before a light struck me in the face. It was a small, wavering light, and then I saw two. I heard a voice say, "He is alive." I blinked my eyes a few times, struggled to sit up, and finally succeeded. Hands felt my body, pressing my ribs one by one. "Nothing is broken," I heard the voice say. I managed to focus my eyes and saw that Almondo, the physician, knelt beside me. "I think I am all right," I said hoarsely. "That is fine, Bach. You relax now, and I'll look at the others." Another light came toward me, and then a third came into being beside it. This partly dispelled the gloom, and I saw Nard. "Here's a light for you," he said. I struggled to my feet and took the light. I stood still for a moment, shutting off the pain which seemed to wash over me. Then suddenly, I remembered you. Where were you? "Jovian!" I called. I turned and staggered toward the hunched figure of Almondo. "Jovian?" I asked as I approached. "Jovian lives," Almondo replied. Then I saw the frail, crumpled figure of Luna. Almondo saw my gaze. "She does not live," he replied to my unasked question. I straightened, still shaking. I only vaguely remember that next hour. I walked with Almondo, carrying two of his kits, helping where I could. I do remember my surprise, walking down the sloping deck at finding water sloshing on the floor, gradually deepening as we went forward. "We are in a sea of some kind," Almondo told me. "Floating. It's night outside." I nodded dumbly and followed him about. Occasionally, we sealed up rooms with the aid of Nard to provide buoyancy, for the water was deepening. "I think the ship will float," Nard said at last. Still incapable of thought, I followed Nard back to the control room. We emerged from the water, our feet making sloshing sounds, fainter and fainter, until we walked on the deck. I looked around the control room, counting those who lay on mats. "You should stay here and rest," Almondo said. "I'm all right," I replied. "What is there to do now? It's better that I stay busy." Almondo looked down at four very still figures near the port. "There are these," he said. "Perhaps it would be best to put them in this alien sea." I sighed. Nard walked over to one of the four who had perished, and between us. We lifted the thin figure of Aeon. Kimmy lay beside him. I thought perhaps it was better that they had died together. Then Nard and I stepped through the portal and into the slanting corridor. Down and down we walked until we stepped into the water. Nard paused and pulled on a handle. An outer portal opened, which was as yet a foot above the water. Still holding Aeon by one arm, he pulled the gangplank loose from its fastenings and swung it down from the ceiling. It slid outward on its rollers and clicked rigidly into place. With a bang, the collapsible steps dropped to the deck before us. Silently, we eased Aeon upward and walked out over the black, heaving water. Our burden was less, but our hearts heavier, as we walked back to the control room. Perhaps it was the cold air, or perhaps the lifeless bodies of my friends, but thought began to stir within me again. As we carried Kimmy to the port, I wondered what would become of us. As we re-entered the ship, I asked, "Has anyone signaled for help?" "What with?" Nard asked, shrugging. Well, the signaling equipment, it's been smashed. The power's off except for our hand lights. He shrugged again. It wouldn't reach far enough anyway. We're a long way from the Union. I see, I murmured. We reached the control room again and carried another to the port. I stood for a moment on the gangplank after the splash that marked the departure of a friend and looked about. I could see nothing. The sky was overcast and the darkness nearly complete. The waters were barely visible. A gusty, salty breeze threw bits of spray in my face. I sighed and followed Nard back to the control room. In a few moments, we'd placed Luna in the heaving waters, and returning, we closed the portal partly to keep out the cold, damp breeze. Nard, I suggested, could we somehow signal with the lights or some such device to attract any possible rescuers? Nard sighed. I've thought of that, he said, but there will be no rescuers. No rescuers? They don't know where we are, Nard explained. You didn't leave any information. Jovian didn't clear the ship. Michael didn't call it in. And I didn't think to do anything. In Jovian's absence, I could have provided the information for Michael. I just, didn't expect. Don't blame yourself, I said, quickly. It's surely my fault. Oh, that doesn't matter now. Perhaps the ship is not too badly damaged, I said, brightening. We can make repairs, and I'll help. All you need to do is tell me what should be done. Nard smiled again. This ship will never fly again, he said, calmly. I felt my mind going blank, as though refusing to accept what the words conveyed. But I straightened my shoulders and determined to find some means of relieving our present situation. Try as I might, I could think of nothing, and discouragement grew within me. Is there no hope then, Nard? I asked. I do not know, he replied slowly. There is the surface exploratory craft, but... He paused. It'll only carry 5. No more. But that gives us hope, I exclaimed. Is it spaceworthy? Yes, Nard answered. I checked it, and it is undamaged. It could make the voyage to the fringe of the Union. He seemed to hesitate. It would take 5 years. Without comment, I walked into the control room and over to Almondo, who was kneeling at your side. How's Jovian? I asked. Jovian will live, Almondo said, but the condition is serious. Could Jovian survive if the exploratory craft is spaceworthy? Almondo got to his feet, shaking his head. I think not. Perhaps after a long convalescence, but a long voyage. He paused and looked at me piercingly. The exploratory craft? He asked suddenly. The space is limited, and the voyage would be long. How long? Nard says 5 of this planet's years. They're a trifle shorter than our own. All eyes but your closed ones looked at Nard expectantly. 5 may go, he said. Michael nodded knowingly. I will stay, he said. I feel the need of a rest. No, you must go, Michael, Nard said quickly. A skilled pilot is needed. I would be of no use, so I'll stay. And I, an injured man said. Just a moment, I interrupted. Only 5 may go, and there are 7 of us, 3 of us injured. I came here to study this planet. and I will not leave until I've done so. It may take a long time, but no matter what transpires, I must stay." "Yes, 3 are injured," Almondo added, "but Jovian would never live through the voyage. The others will, as their injuries are relatively slight. I feel the flight should begin at once, for delay might prove disastrous." A thrill of horror touched me, knowing that you were doomed to stay with me. Your love of freedom, of the good things in life, you, condemned to a planet of madness, of carnage and destruction. Yet I knew there was no other way. "Very well," I said. "Jovian and I will remain. I must stay anyway, and I'll care for Jovian." Almondo picked up a light and left the control room, his footsteps echoing softly. Then the slosh of water came to me as his descending steps brought him to that seepage from an alien sea. "There is a portal here," Nard said. "Perhaps we can open it." Michael went to assist him. I heard the clank of fastenings, and then a breath of air blew in upon me, becoming a steady breeze. To the right, a large rectangle of near blackness stood out from the total blackness of the walls. There was silence then in the room, and I listened to the strange voice of this strange sea lapping against the broken hull of our ship. I felt no desire to talk. I glanced occasionally at you. Then at length I turned and walked to that rectangle and stood facing that forbidding darkness. Nard was attempting to be cheerful. "We may be able to intercept a rescue vessel if one comes," he said. "Of course, our craft has only a micro-beam transmitter, but it's possible that they would come within range. If we can detect one, it's fairly certain that we will be able to contact it. If not, we will eventually. The exploratory craft has its own air and water regenerating systems and food synthesizers, and is, in all, fairly comfortable." I turned my mind away from the conversation and back to the darkness which hung like a pall over this planet. 5 years. 5 years of this planet on our own was a long time. Under other circumstances, it could be short, but here it could only be long. We might survive, and we might not. We were aliens, strangers, and we would have to live without our technology. There were innumerable problems, but the greatest one was you. You had always loved freedom, and now you were chained to a deadly and dreadful soil, chained because you would have to live a hunted, furtive life, a life of isolation and eternal hiding, constant vigilance. You would have preferred death, and I wondered. At last, I reached a decision. I turned my eyes to the blackened sky and formed a thought aimed to the ancient star gods. I called upon them to take your life to them in the heavens, where you could be free. I couldn't fail to make the appeal, for possibly, just possibly, the star gods might be listening. I finished my prayer and went on staring into the blackness. The voice of Almondo sounded from the portal behind me. "I've examined the exploratory craft," he said. "It seems in order, but I leave that to Nard. However, I've carefully measured the space, and I find that 4 might survive the trip. 5, however, would have insufficient room for movement. To have one person die would, of course, risk the lives of the others. In fact, it would probably cause difficulties, which would be near insurmountable. 4 then," Nard said in a matter-of-fact tone. He was prepared to say more, but Almondo continued. "I've placed medical supplies aboard, and have straightened up the interior for occupancy, checked the purity of food and water, and performed a quick analysis on the air content. I've also placed several of my recorded instructions in the small cabinet by the pilot's seat. I think these will serve you. I'm staying with Jovian and Bach." "No, I shall stay," Nard said. "They will need you." That's nonsense," Almondo replied. "As I said, I've prepared for anything that I could handle in person, and Jovian will not live without my attention. Now, time is of great importance, so let us not debate what is obvious." There was, however, some small debate. At length, I interrupted. "I believe Almondo is right," I said to Nard. "I'm nominally directing the flight, and I must ask that you and Michael and the two injured leave at once." I pointed to the rectangle. "You'll note it is growing light. We shall have little time, and it's advisable that you leave before you're seen." We discussed the matter hurriedly and decided that Michael would ferry you, Almondo, and myself to the nearest shore and would then return. Immediately, upon his return, they would open one of the sealed rooms and allow the ocean access. Our ship would sink soon after their takeoff. Almondo and I carried you carefully to the small craft housed in a chamber which was now open to this strange world. Just as we'd finished arranging you, Nard and Michael arrived carrying bundles. "We've gathered all the food, clothing, and supplies that are left," Nard said. "You'll need them." We hurriedly packed in the bundles and assorted items, then closed the tiny port. Michael eased the craft away from the mothership in a masterly fashion. I stared at the small port beside me. Through its transparent thickness, I could see little, but I was savoring these precious minutes of flight. I would fly no more for a long time, if ever. I realized the immenseness of the universe and the minuteness of this vessel against that mighty backdrop. Here, far beyond the Union, in a wild and untouched region, this tiny dot would be unfindable. Far away, there were well-traveled space lanes, and there were outposts which could pick up the feeble signals from this craft. I noted that Michael was already operating the small transmitter, sending out a continuous call for help. I leaned back on a faintly humming power unit, wondering, was it possible that a search vessel would hear? Or would they ever approach this planet at all after finding traces of a crash in that other space? I knew, too, how pitifully weak the signals were that reached outward. An outpost station with its incredibly sensitive receiver could pick up signals from great distances, but a ship with its necessarily small equipment? I shrugged. The chances were small. "I see a shoreline," Michael said. The unusually heavy, overcast sky had cleared somewhat here, and reflected sunlight from the planet's satellite filtered down, giving vague illumination. The shoreline was a white, thin line drawn on the darkness below. We began to drop swiftly toward that line, and as we did, I asked a question. What of the metaspace equipment? Could it not be applied to this craft? "I'm afraid no," Michael answered. "It's a larger machine than this entire craft." He hesitated, then glanced over his shoulder. "Would you reconsider? I would not mind remaining." I realized that I shouldn't have asked the question. "Oh, no," I replied in as casual a voice as I could muster. "I shall be quite interested in studying this planet. I merely thought that it might hasten your trip. I must remain anyway, and it makes no difference how I do it." Michael halted the descent of our ship, and we hovered over an inlet, which seemed partly sheltered. I directed Michael to land there, and a moment later, the tiny craft crunched on the white sand. Almost immediately, we had the hatch open, and Almondo and I carefully transferred you to the beach. Then, as rapidly as possible, we unloaded our supplies. "You must hurry, Michael," I said. "It's growing lighter every minute." He nodded and looked at me earnestly. "When we return, we'll wait for you here at this spot," he said huskily. I promise that I will be here myself and will watch for your thought night and day." "We'll be ready," I answered, "and a pleasant voyage to you." Michael unwillingly closed the portal. Then we stood back and watched the little craft rise into the sky. "Well," Armando sighed, "we're natives now." "For a while," I agreed. "However, let us set about preparing some sort of accommodations for ourselves. This wind is rather cool." Armando nodded, and we glanced about the inlet. We noticed a spot not far away where trees grew. They were an odd vegetation with coarse bark. We carried you to these trees, which broke the wind somewhat. Then, covering you with some of the extra clothing, we left and began bringing back our supplies. We made comments about the interesting features about us, noting within ourselves the ever-lightening sky above, wondering whether a tiny ship was leaving at that moment. At last, we knew it must have gone, and our conversation became sparse. We sat huddled in that grove of trees for some time. Some of the branches we brought close about us for protection and to screen us from any casual eyes. We hadn't yet seen any living thing, although we had heard the sounds of birds. The first thing we saw was a peculiar bird. It lit on the beach too far away to be studied and walked around, aimlessly pecking at debris. The sky was now bright, though gray and dismal. Armando sighed deeply and asked, "How often does it become night in one of these years?" "A little more than 360 times," I answered thoughtfully. "The nights are not warm like on Arkna." "It's not good to think of such things," I said. "It's better perhaps that we try to adjust." "Yes, I know," Armando murmured. "What do the inhabitants look like?" "Like us," I replied. "They're a bit darker on the average, but we should be able to pass as natives. That's probably the least of our difficulties." "Perhaps so," Armando replied. "Well, I think we should eat something soon. You haven't eaten for some time." "Yes," I agreed. We rummaged through our things and found some food concentrates. It was a rather desultory meal, and I found myself wondering what we would do for food when our supplies were gone. I wondered about many things, and Armando seemed to be doing the same. "How's Jovian?" I asked, finally. Armando looked at you. "Fine, for the present. However, we'll have to find a place for Jovian soon. I may have to operate." We lapsed into silence again, and then Armando said, "Bach, what are we going to do? We can't just stay here." "I know," I murmured. "I've been keeping my mind receptive. You see, I don't know where we are or how far from any inhabitants we might be. I've hesitated to probe too far. Well, it's better to be safe." Armando nodded. "Perhaps you're right." "All we need is information," I replied. "When one of the inhabitants comes near enough, I'll seek data from his mind. You may tune your mind to mine if you don't feel able to reach him directly." "You don't mind?" Armando asked. Custom and politeness flew away with Michael. We only have one task: to stay alive. "Yes," Armando agreed. "You're right." He paused. "But the inhabitants, could they know?" "Could they detect my probe?" I asked. "I don't think so, but it's a risk we will have to take." Armando sighed, and we sat in silence. Again, my mind probed outward, seeking, feeling for the mind of another. Finally, one came within range. He was on foot, walking, not too far away. Greedily, I reached into his mind, searching, examining, and classifying. Almondo frowned in concentration. In a moment, I was finished, and I released the contact. "Well," I said, brightening, "now we have something to go on." "Did he detect the probe?" Almondo asked, anxiously. "No," I replied. "He didn't even know it was possible." "Oh," Almondo frowned in puzzlement. "But what can we do with the information?" "First, I now have a general idea of the language. Second, I believe I identified the metal of which my note container is made. It's called platinum here." "But of what use is that to us?" "Some people have what they call cigarette cases." I mouthed the word carefully. "Our contact didn't have one, but others whom he thought of as swells did. My note container looks almost like one of these cigarette cases. They use a medium of exchange on this world, and there's a city not far from here wherein such exchanges are made. It's called L.A. "What do you propose to do?" Almondo asked. I stood up suddenly. "I believe that if I tuck my tunic inside my waistband, I can pass for an inhabitant." I did this as I spoke. I glanced at my sandals. They would pass too, I hoped. I ripped the collar on my tunic so that it hung open and pressed the edges down. "How do I look?" I asked. "Terrible," Almondo answered. "Where are you going?" "To L.A. I'll return as soon as possible with some form of transportation, and then we can find a place for Jovian. I don't doubt that you can influence the minds of any inhabitants who come nearby, so they will avoid you." "I think so," Almondo agreed. "You can contact me by report anytime you choose," I finished. Almondo nodded and watched worriedly as I began walking away. I walked a short way beyond the trees and then saw a roadway of some sort ahead. I made my way to it and stood there, watching vehicles approaching and passing. They were a strange type of conveyance, like nothing I'd ever seen before. At last, I found the one I wanted. The driver was going to the center of L.A., which I discovered was an abbreviation for Los Angeles. I extended my hand in the manner pictured by my first contact. I'd already prepared my first speech, which was, "Is yous going into the big town, bud?" As the vehicle was stopping, I realized that my first contact had been a man of inadequate education and a little different from the average inhabitant. I was able to rephrase my question in time. The operator of the vehicle swung the door open, and I studied him for a moment. "Are you going into Los Angeles?" I asked. Yeah, hop in," he answered somewhat doubtfully. I settled myself in the strange seat, noting that his trousers were the length of his legs, while mine ended at my knees. I watched carefully for the explanations he thought up for me. Then at the proper moment, I selected one. "I guess you might call me a shipwrecked sailor." He glanced at me guardedly and said, "Oh?" "Yes, I was on a moonlight sail last night and capsized. I managed to crawl on top of the skiff and drift in. I nearly froze to death." "Oh, you live near here?" "As a matter of fact," I said, "I left Ocean Park, or near it." "Is that where you're going?" he asked. "I can drop you right there." "Well, no, I have to get to work," I said. "I have a change of clothes down at the office. I can have the skiff picked up for me." Sure," he said more confidently. I leaned back against the seat cushion, and he seemed to accept this as natural. I relaxed and let my eyes close, although I kept my mind closely attuned to the driver's and allowed Almondo to pick up my thoughts. Occasionally, I flashed explanations and suggestions to Almondo. My probing was very delicate for fear this person might detect it, although the inhabitants obviously didn't have any general knowledge of mental communication. I was getting a clearer idea of the culture of the vicinity and felt I should be able to handle myself. At last I stirred and raised my head. "Oh, almost there," I said. "I think I'll knock off work early today. I feel about done in." "I'll bet you do," my acquaintance said, smiling. "I'm surely indebted to you for the ride," I said. "Perhaps I can buy you a drink." "Oh, thanks just the same, but I don't think so. It's a little early in the morning for me." His mind flashed to several thoughts, and he became distinctly curious about me. I was already prepared, so I said, "I'm a writer for one of the studios. I have an office downtown." This explanation filled all of his questions and gave me a background to a certain extent. "Never had much connection with the picture industry," he replied. "Must be interesting." "Oh, yes," I said, "but, well, it gets monotonous at times, too." We were nearly in the city, for other vehicles were moving rather densely about us, thereby occupying my temporary companion's mind. Passing thought stimuli were causing my subject to react in thousands of subtle ways, yielding up more and more information. Then I received the knowledge that we were nearly in the center of town. "Well, I'll drop off here if you don't mind," I said. He drew to a stop at the next corner. "Is this close enough to your office?" he asked. "Yes, thank you very much," I said, opening the door. "Hope I see you again sometime. Maybe I can buy you that drink then." "That's okay," he replied. "I hope you don't have any more trouble." I smiled and closed the door. I stood looking up and down the street for a moment. A block away was a rather shabby lawn with trees of an unusual variety here and there. Horribly noisy conveyances darted back and forth, some on metal rails, others apparently self-contained. If my informant was not mistaken, the places I sought would be in the opposite direction. I turned and walked several squares until I noticed a small, garishly painted establishment. I concentrated on those within and learned that this was what I wanted, a pawn shop. I opened the door and walked in. A man greeted me almost at once. Having already decided the best approach, I dropped my record container on the counter. "What's it worth?" I asked. "I paid $500 for it." The man behind the counter replied. He picked up the case and studied it. I impressed the thought on his mind that it was a cigarette case. "Well, you paid $500, you say?" "It's platinum," I said. "If you'll wait just a moment," the man said. He went to the rear of the shop and called the attention of another man. The two came forward, the newcomer picking up the case. "Yes," the newcomer said. "I imagine he did. Beautiful work." He looked at me. "Did you want to sell this or pawn it? I can give you more on a sale." "I'd like to redeem it," I said. "I just need the cash until the bank opens." I waited for a moment, picking up the impressions from this man. I selected one of his explanations. "Got into a little poker game last night." He laughed. "Oh, yes, well, that happens to all of us once in a while. Let's see, I can give you 200. "That's good enough," I murmured. "I'll pick it up this afternoon anyway." There was a slight delay while they made marks on various slips and tags, then they asked me for my signature. As I scrawled a name, I impressed an image on the mind of the man before me. He glanced at the name. "Seems to me I've heard of you." "I'm a writer," I said. A vague memory stirred within his mind, seeming to agree with this. "Ah, yeah, that's it," he murmured. "Well, drop in again, sir." The other man brought over a handful of the medium of exchange. "Will tens be okay?" he asked. "Fine," I said, accepting the bills. I felt both pairs of eyes on me as I walked out of the shop. I shook my head slightly. For some reason, this medium of exchange meant more to those men than a man's word or his promise. What kind of philosophy was this? I wondered. I shrugged and walked on down the street, touching mines here and there until I found one that was satisfactory. With the information, I walked a short distance and found a clothing establishment, and not long afterward I was again on the street, dressed in rough, uncomfortable material, but looking very much like a native. I thought of stopping for food, but time was important. I turned my mind to the concept gambling, which I had obtained in the pawn shop. I found it difficult to find a place to gamble, but finally I located a small, partly hidden place and pressed the signal button by the door. After a pause, the door was opened by an uncouth character who looked at me suspiciously. "I thought I'd drop a few bucks," I said. "Who sent you?" he asked. I extracted the answer from his mind and satisfied him. He allowed me to come in, and I followed him up a flight of stairs. There were several men lounging near the door, one of whom thought he vaguely remembered me and nodded in recognition. I jerked my head toward him, thereby removing the last trace of suspicion. In the far corner of the room, a man wearing an eye shade sat at a round, green-covered table. In another corner, a rather cadaverous individual stood beside a table which held a large wheel having characters prominently displayed on its surface. This was the man, I decided. I walked toward him, picking up the details of his game as I did so. This, I discovered, was roulette. I drew a couple of bills from my pocket and laid them down. Lazily, the operator shoved a stack of discs toward me, which he called chips. I took a deep breath and held it for a moment, then let it out slowly. As I did this, I perceived the table a few minutes in the future, noting a series of winning numbers. To begin with, I lost 2 chips. On the next turn of the wheel, I lost 2 more. I grinned, shrugged my shoulders, and placed 10 on the winning number. Nonchalantly, the operator saw the numbered pocket into which the ball fell and placed 35 chips of a different color beside my stack. I lost several more turns, then won another, this time with 5 blue chips. The operator's eyes widened slightly as he shoved another stack of chips toward me. I lost more, won more, ever building the odds upward so that ever greater sums were being wagered. Several people were watching now, some essaying bets of their own. Finally, the operator and some of his associates became too tense, and one of them looked at me and said, "Betting limit is $100. I noted that I had several times this amount on the table. "That's me," I chuckled. "I'm hot this morning." I placed 10 of the blue chips on a number, losing. I selected another losing number, and with most of my resources on the table thus gone, I selected a winning number. Time was important, but I had to do this properly. I mounted my bet winnings as rapidly as I dared. When I knew I had as much as I could obtain with my last bet, I placed this on an unusual combination, although the wager was not as large as the others had been. I won this. The man, who apparently was in charge, appearing somewhat nervous, said, "That breaks the table." Very carefully, they counted out the cash, and I noticed some ill will. I gave a mental nudge to the man who had thought he recognized me. He responded immediately by exclaiming, "He's sure hot today. Dropped twice that much at Harry's last week." The proprietors began to feel better. In their minds, the certainty grew that I would be back and lose more than I'd won. They cordially offered to send a man with me if I wanted to deposit the money in a bank, but I declined as though the money was unimportant. Now I had a start. Throughout the plays, I had probed the minds of onlookers for a better way of amassing this medium of exchange. One had thought of the stock market. He was not too well informed, but he did know the name and location of a stock broker, whatever that might be. Once on the street again, I set out trying to find this stock broker. As I was walking, Almondo flashed a thought to me. "What in the name of the universe are you doing?" "You'll see," I telepathed. "How's Jovian?" "As well as can be expected under the circumstances. When are you coming back?" "Just as soon as I can," I replied. "I'm doing everything as fast as I possibly can." "But it all seems so senseless," Almondo flashed. "Everyone and everything around you seems senseless. Are you sure you're all right?" "Yes, I'm fine. Don't worry. I shall return soon." Almondo's mind became receptive again, and I made my way as fast as possible to the broker. I discovered that he was a man who operated a business of buying and selling a sort of intangible interest in equally intangible associations, or companies. I had a little difficulty understanding the principle of this, so I stood outside the door of the broker's office, familiarizing myself with the process. When I felt capable of handling this incredible affair called playing the market, I stepped inside.